So it was the day of Pentecost, and the disciples were gathered together, and there was a sudden burst of a mighty wind, and the house where they were was shaken, and it was filled with this mighty wind. And as that mighty wind came the cloven tongues of fire upon each one of them. And they were filled with the Holy Spirit. And they began to speak in other tongues. Now, the people around heard what was going on, and they basically thought they were all drunk. Now Peter will preach a message and basically tell them they are not drunk. They are not drunk with wine. They are filled and drunk with the Spirit of God. And because the Spirit of God was present and moving after a sermon that Peter gave, not about self-improvement, but about Jesus Christ being the Messiah, then the crowd responded. And 3,000 were added because the Spirit of God moved and came upon them. They weren't following techniques of business outlined by Peter Drucker or C. Peter Wagner or anyone. It's the Spirit of God. So I'm on this thing about the church growth movement, and I just did a video on that, give you some of my thoughts. And I'm ready to follow up on it already, and I haven't left the little cafe, Black Canyon Cafe, where I'm at, here in the mall in Chiang Mai. Now that's not whiskey, that's tea. You might think it's whiskey. So what did they start out with? We'll try to remember. And basically, you had traditional churches. And new churches weren't popping up everywhere back in the late 70s, early 80s. So they said basically, people in a normal, traditional style church, go out and survey the community and find out what they want. Now notice that, what they want, not what is needed. Peter knew what was needed, a message from God. And the Holy Spirit anointed the message. And because the Holy Spirit anointed the message, 3,000 came in. Had nothing to do with surveying people and asking them what they want. So you do this survey. What do you want in a church? Tell me. What offends you? What don't you like? So then the next step was you take back to your church, your traditional church, the changes that people want to make. Because it's about pleasing the consumer. This is consumerism, by the way. It's not really spiritual at all. Now, if you're in a traditional church and you have some folks who do not want to participate in these new corny ideas, you've got to ignore them, silence them, or put them out. Now that was done, and there was an awful lot of hurt in traditional churches because people that were trying to claim the faith and cling to some of the things that meant so much to them for many years were offended, ignored, silenced, or put out. Now, it's not to say that some changes could not have been implemented that were needed, but this aggressive aspect of this church growth movement pushed the idea of silencing them, not listening to them, not working with them. Now that's an area that will definitely cause split. So the idea then is to take all these things that you found in your survey and what people said they want or don't want in the church, and then implement them. And as you implement them, you replace the traditional with the so-called contemporary. Now, you have to understand something. The whole idea of traditional worship versus contemporary worship is false. Worship is worship. Now, the true test is it genuine worship or false worship? And we have cases of that, and particularly in the Old Testament, where the sons of Aaron offer strange fire. And that strange fire thing is about violating what God wanted, violating the holiness. And strange could be better translated as foreign or not approved by God. So they did some things that were not approved by God. And hence, that form of contemporary worship was silenced immediately. Now, what tended to happen was that congregations began to split into two halves. You had your contemporary people and you had your traditional people. And as you might well figure it, it really was an age differential. At a certain age level, you could see that the contemporary people were all, say, younger than 40. And the traditional people were all, say, over 40. Now, I just arbitrarily drew the line at 40, but basically speaking, it was the older people that remained firm on traditional types of things in the light of the church. Now, what happened was that basically a lot of churches couldn't handle this, and you had a lot of infighting and a lot of splits. And the term that was used at that time was worship wars. Terrible, terrible way of looking at worship. It's about wars. The contemporaries versus the traditionals. Now, as I said, that's a false dichotomy. Worship is worship, and one shouldn't be thrown into one category or the other. All right? Now, many contemporary churches began springing up. In other words, trying to work within the traditional mainline church was just too frustrating, and hence groups got together and said, we'll just start something completely new. Never mind taking the traditional church and transforming it into a contemporary. So currently in America, in many, many places where the population is growing, you will see these modern churches. And many times you can tell they're the modern churches in that a lot of times they don't even have windows because they have a stage with lighting, and they want to do big light shows rather than have windows and let in sunlight, let people see through the glass. So I've noticed that a lot of them are block buildings, built a little similarly to like warehouses, but they're interested in space So they're not interested in appealing to the senses by putting in windows. Now my thought is that they really don't want them anyhow, because they want everything to be controlled by a lighting system. Now you're going to probably disagree with a lot of what I've said, and that's okay, because I don't really care. I'm not really seeking your agreement. I'm just seeking to present to you some of my thoughts after 42 years of ministry, from 1981 to 2023. I covered the span of this contemporary traditional stuff. I was involved in it in a little bit, trying to bring a little bit of it to churches that I've served. But I soon found out that some of it was just about forcing their ways upon the older population too, and not necessarily wanting to, quote, reform the church like the great reformers. So not everyone who wanted to necessarily implement these things was bad or sinful. Please don't hear that. And not everything that was to be implemented was necessarily bad or sinful. It's just that it did create conflict, and the results were the splitting of the church. And I remember when I was serving a church, I wanted to, quote, start a contemporary service. Get in on the act, so to speak. And I sought the counsel of those who were governing the church at the time, and they thought about it, prayed about it, and I never forget, the individual who was in charge of that area said to me, "No, it will split the congregation in two." And that was good counsel. So I never ever started a, quote, contemporary service. Worship was worship. Now I did try to bring some of the modern things into that, such as projecting of words on a screen, and some of the newer music that at that time was rather pure. Now a lot of the music that's coming out of some of these places like Hillsong is not pure. Okay? And so all the music needs to be examined carefully. Well, I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and I want to stop right here and say thank you. End of video.